For most of the Second World War, German soldiers believed, deeply and confidently, that their artillery was the finest in Europe. They had grown up hearing legends about the 88-millimeter gun, the Acht, a weapon feared by tank crews and pilots alike. They marched into France in 1940 behind rolling barrages from the 105-millimeter LFEH-18, convinced their doctrine of Schwerpunkt firepower had no equal. On the Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942, they watched Soviet units collapse under methodical German bombardment. Every campaign reinforced the belief that German gunnery, German forward observers, and German fire discipline represented the gold standard of modern warfare. The Wehrmacht entered Normandy, Oettingen, and the Ardennes, still carrying this confidence. They expected that if the Americans excelled in anything, it would be tanks, industry, trucks, or aircraft, not artillery. To the German frontline soldier, American guns were an afterthought. The United States had no famous 88, no legendary 150-millimeter howitzer, no feared siege mortar. Americans, they assumed, relied on mass production rather than precision, quantity rather than skill. And so, in the months leading up to D-Day, Wehrmacht reports routinely described U.S. artillery as adequate, ordinary, or inferior to German equipment. The irony was that the Americans quietly possessed something far more dangerous than a superior gun. They possessed an entirely different system of artillery, one that emphasized speed, flexibility, coordination, and massed firepower in ways the Germans had never encountered. This difference remained invisible until the fighting began. German infantry in Normandy expected slow, predictable barrages. Instead, they were hit with rapid shifts of fire, precise concentrations, and near-instant responses to their movements. Panzer crews advancing at Mortain expected to outrun American shells. Instead, they found themselves bracketed in minutes by fire that adjusted faster than their radios could report. But before these shocks unfolded, the Germans entered the campaign with complete confidence in their own superiority. Part of the myth came from Germany's early war successes. During the 1939 to 1942 period, German artillery had indeed been highly effective. The system worked well in mobile warfare. Forward observers calling for fire, battalion guns delivering fast support, and medium batteries concentrating on breakthrough points. The Germans believed this formula was universal. Few realized that it depended heavily on experienced observers, intact communications, and well-trained crews, all of which were eroding by 1944. Meanwhile, the Americans had spent the interwar years developing a system that did not rely on individual brilliance. Instead, it relied on standardized procedures and mathematical precision. Yet German frontline troops had no idea such developments had taken place. Many assumed American gunners were amateurs. The United States had not fought a major land war since 1918. Few U.S. commanders were famous in Europe, and American equipment was often mocked for being industrial rather than refined. Tank crews joked that American armor was built more like tractors. Luftwaffe pilots mocked the Sherman silhouette from the air. Artillery officers believed U.S. 105-millimeter guns were simply copies of European designs. This cultural underestimation was reinforced by the German belief in technological superiority. German doctrine placed great faith in high-quality optics, precision-machined weapons, and exacting craftsmanship. They assumed artillery effectiveness depended primarily on the gun itself, the barrel, the breech, the carriage. What they did not understand was that the Americans had shifted focus entirely. For the U.S. Army, the gun was only one part of the equation. The real weapon was the fire direction center, the mathematicians, observers, radios, and tables that transformed a collection of howitzers into a unified, coordinated, devastating machine. To German soldiers in 1944, this concept was alien. When they thought of artillery, they imagined individual batteries firing independently or slowly coordinating under regimental supervision. They had never seen the kind of lightning-fast concentration that American artillery could produce. And so, when the first rounds began landing in Normandy with startling accuracy, some only minutes after German units were detected, many dismissed it as luck. When it kept happening, they called it coincidence. When the barrages began shifting with uncanny precision from hedgerow to hedgerow, from approach route to fallback line, their confidence finally began to crack. Captured after battles in Normandy, Brittany, Lorraine, and the Ardennes, many German POWs expressed the same bewildered sentiment. We thought our artillery was the best in the world. We were wrong. But on the eve of the Normandy landings, none of them knew this yet. They still believed the 88 was king. They still believed their observers were unmatched. They still believed the Americans relied on brute force rather than technical mastery. They went into battle expecting to be challenged by American tanks, aircraft, or infantry. What they encountered instead was a weapon they had never prepared for. American artillery that moved faster, hit harder, and reacted with a speed no German unit had ever faced before. The first time German soldiers encountered the American Fire Direction Center, though none of them knew the term, they sensed immediately that something was different. They were accustomed to artillery that behaved in predictable patterns, a few ranging shots, a slow adjustment, and then a sustained barrage once fire control officers reached a decision. This was how German, British, and even Soviet artillery typically operated at the company and battalion level. But when American shells began to fall in Normandy, the speed and precision startled them. It felt as if American gunners could see through hedgerows, read their movements, and react instantly to even the smallest shift in German positions. This uncanny responsiveness came from a technological and procedural revolution that the U.S. Army had quietly perfected long before D-Day. The heart of it was the Fire Direction Center, FDC, a centralized command node that coordinated the fire of every gun in a battalion and, when needed, every gun in an entire division or corps. Unlike the German system, where individual batteries often acted semi-independently, the American FDC turned artillery into a single, coherent weapon. The roots of the FDC went back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where officers like Major Carlos Brewer and Major Orlando Ward spent the 1930s redesigning artillery doctrine from the ground up. Their goal was simple but revolutionary: use mathematics, standardized maps, and rapid calculation tools to turn requests for fire into accurate, simultaneous bombardment in minutes rather than tens of minutes. The breakthrough came with the invention of the graphical firing table by Captain Abbott Burns in 1940. Prior to Burns' invention, calculating the firing solution for a moving target could take 15 minutes or more. With the graphical tables, essentially analog computers, trained officers could compute directions in under 3 minutes, even under stress. This was the first advantage American artillery had over the Germans: speed of calculation. The second advantage was structure. Every American artillery battalion had an FDC staffed by trained specialists whose only job was to compute firing data. German artillery often relied on the battery commander and a handful of non-commissioned officers for these tasks. When a German unit moved or took casualties, accuracy suffered. The American system, by contrast, was modular. Any forward observer could talk to any FDC, which could then direct any available battery. This flexibility gave American artillery a fluidity that seemed impossible to German units expecting rigid procedures. The third advantage was communications. The United States entered the war with a massive radio industry, and its artillery battalions were equipped with reliable SCR 610, SCR 193, and SCR-284 radios. Forward observers, whether on foot, in tanks, or flying in L-4 grasshoppers, could talk directly to the FDC. German observers, by comparison, still relied heavily on field telephones that required intact wire lines, lines easily severed by shell fire, tanks, or simple sabotage. When German communications went down, their artillery became blind. When American communications went down, airborne or armored observers could take over. The fourth advantage was the standardized coordinate grid. The American system used uniform map grids and the consistent mathematical method known as shift from a known point, which allowed any observer to call fire accurately even if they were lost or disoriented. German observers needed precise location data and a stable line of sight, both rare in fast-moving combat. Together, these innovations produced something the Germans had never faced, an artillery system that responded to requests in 3 to 5 minutes, with accuracy high enough that battalion after battalion of grenadiers reported feeling hunted by American guns. Panzer commanders described trying to maneuver through hedgerows only to be bracketed by shells within minutes. Officers at every level complained that American artillery fired too fast and adjusted too well. To the Germans, it felt supernatural. To the Americans, it was simply the result of training. FDC teams worked like clockwork. A forward observer spotted the target. The FDC took the bearing, range, and correction and instantly computed firing data. The battery executive officer relayed commands. Guns swung into position, charges were set, shells were loaded, fuse types, time, impact, delay were determined based on the observer's needs. And then, the thing German POWs later described as terrifying happened. Multiple batteries fired simultaneously at the same target. This was the American concept of total battalion fire. If the observer needed more, he could call for time on target. Every gun fired so that all shells arrived at the target at the same moment, an effect that had no German equivalent. Soldiers caught in the open during a hot strike didn't get a warning. They heard nothing until the shells detonated, dozens at once. The Germans had thought their artillery was the finest in the world. On paper, many German guns were indeed excellent, but the Americans had built something entirely different, a system that turned coordination, speed, and mathematics into a weapon far more devastating than the quality of any single cannon. This was the beginning of the realization among German POWs that American artillery was not just good, it was something unprecedented, a machine of war operating with frightening speed, precision, and inevitability. For German soldiers fighting in Normandy, Lorraine, the Hurtgen Forest, and the Ardennes, the most terrifying thing about American artillery was not the size of the guns or the weight of the shells. It was the sense that the Americans always knew exactly where they were. No matter how carefully German infantry hid around thick hedgerows, no matter how quietly panzer grenadiers moved through the forests, no matter how well panzer crews parked their tanks under camouflage nets, American shells found them. Sometimes it took 5 minutes, sometimes 3, sometimes less. And nearly every German POW interrogation after June 1944 gave the same explanation for this uncanny accuracy: die kleinen Flugzeuge, the little airplanes. They were referring to the L-4 Grasshopper, the tiny, slow, unarmed liaison aircraft that floated over the battlefield like a dragonfly. To American artillerymen, the L-4 was an essential tool. To German frontline troops, it became a symbol of impending catastrophe. Its presence, often noticed only as a faint buzzing sound or a glint above the treetops, meant that death was minutes away. The L-4 had no armor, no guns, and no speed. Yet it turned American artillery into the deadliest weapon the Germans faced. The concept was simple.
put a trained forward observer in the sky. Unlike a ground observer who could see only a slice of the battlefield, the L-4 crew could spot enemy troops moving through hedgerows, trucks concealed under foliage, gun pits dug behind barns, and tanks attempting to reverse into cover. They flew at treetop level or just above it, slow enough that the observer could track movements in real time. And from that little cabin, using radios like the SCR-610 or later SCR-300, the observer could direct artillery with stunning precision. Every American division had multiple L-4s. Some had entire artillery observation squadrons. They operated from improvised fields, cow pastures, roads, or flat patches of earth. They needed almost no fuel. They could take off in under 100 feet and land nearly anywhere. Most importantly, they were always airborne. To the Germans, they seemed impossible to shoot down, not because they were tough, but because they were invisible until too late. An L-4 flying low and slow blended with the background. By the time German troops saw one, the observer had already marked their position. And unlike German artillery, which often required lengthy fire preparation, the American FDC could react instantly to the L-4's instructions. A typical sequence, reported by countless POWs, went like this. A faint buzzing sound overhead. Someone shouted, "Cucaracha," or "Artillerieflieger." Soldiers scrambled for cover. 2 minutes later, the first American ranging rounds landed. Seconds later, a full battalion of U.S. howitzers, 12 to 24 guns, began firing. The position was obliterated. The L-4 could orbit silently above a battle, adjusting fire with phrases like left 200, drop 50, or fire for effect. Because of the American grid system, the observer needed only relative corrections. The moment adjustments were given, the FDC recalculated, guns re-aimed, and the next salvo arrived exactly where needed. German troops could neither hide nor run. Hedgerows, which they believed would shield them, instead became perfect aiming markers. Forests gave no protection when viewed from above. Even armored vehicles, camouflaged under nets and parked beneath trees, could be spotted by tire tracks or the slight movement of shadows. The psychological impact was immense. German officers wrote that the presence of a single L-4 could lam te lied ka mot doi doi, paralyze an entire company. Panzer crews refused to move during daylight if they thought grasshoppers might be overhead. Infantry waited hours to attack because they feared one buzzing plane would betray them. The Germans tried to counter the L-4. They deployed snipers, machine guns, even light flak. They attempted to hide troop movements behind smoke or move only at dawn and dusk. None of it worked consistently. The L-4 could simply shift to a new angle, find a clearer line of sight, or follow disrupted foliage patterns. Worse for the Germans, the U.S. had so many L-4s that losing one changed nothing. They were cheap, simple, and easy to replace. A destroyed L-4 was swapped out within days. A lost observer was replaced by another officer trained at Fort Sill. One POW from the 352nd Infantry Division summarized the feeling in an interrogation in 1944. "We saw no American artillery. We saw no guns. We saw only the little plane, and then the shells." During the Battle of the Bludge, even when winter weather grounded most Allied aircraft, American grasshoppers still flew low under cloud cover, guiding artillery that stopped German armor columns near Crinkled Rocher and Elsenworn Ridge. The Germans, advancing with tanks and self-propelled guns, were astonished that American fire adjusted so quickly, never realizing that observers in tiny planes were silently tracking them between the snowy tree lines. The L-4 didn't kill anyone directly. It didn't drop bombs or fire bullets. But it made American artillery omniscient. It erased the German advantage of concealment. It turned every hedgerow, every forest path, every farmhouse, every crossroad into a potential kill zone. And long before German POWs came to fear proximity fuses or masked barrages, they learned to fear the little fabric-covered airplane whose slow drifting wings meant that death would follow shortly behind.
If the L-4 Grasshopper made German soldiers feel watched, then the American doctrine of masked fire made them feel hunted. No matter where they fought, hedgerows in Normandy, river crossings in Lorraine, the frozen woods of the Ardennes, or the brutal slopes of Hürtgenwald, German infantry repeatedly reported the same nightmare. American artillery did not behave like separate batteries of guns. It behaved like one colossal weapon, capable of firing from multiple directions at once, all coordinated through an invisible logic that Germans could not decipher. This overwhelming effect came from a uniquely American innovation, the ability to concentrate the fire of entire battalions, regiments, and even corps within minutes, all directed by an FDC that computed firing solutions simultaneously for dozens of guns scattered miles apart. The Germans had nothing like it. Their artillery could hit hard, but it lacked a method for instantly pooling fire from multiple units. When the Americans wanted to hammer a target, they didn't call for one battery to fire. They called for every available gun. To a German soldier on the ground, the result felt apocalyptic. Veterans from the 352nd Infantry Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, and the 116th Panzer Division all confirmed in POW interrogations that once American artillery locked onto a position, the volume of fire escalated with terrifying speed. What began as a few ranging shots could swell into a hurricane of shells from 105mm M2A1 howitzers, 155mm M1 long-tom guns, and even 8-inch and 240mm heavy artillery pieces held at corps level. The Americans formalized this capability with the doctrine of massed battalion fire, and even more devastating, corps concentrations. A single call from a forward observer could bring down bombardment from 48, 72, or even over 100 guns, all striking a target area the size of a football field. To German troops who had spent their early war years watching artillery be allocated sparingly, the shock was enormous. But the most terrifying innovation, the one POWs mentioned again and again, was the American time-on-target, TOT technique. In TOT missions, every gun fired at a different moment so that all shells arrived simultaneously, often within a 2-second window. There was no traditional escalation, no ranging fire for Germans to hear and take cover from, no warning at all. One moment the battlefield was quiet, the next dozens of shells detonated instantly, shredding everything above ground. During TOT strikes, infantry caught in the open had no chance to dive for cover. Panzer grenadiers moving along a hedgerow line were obliterated before they even realized they were targeted. Command posts were wiped out before the first shout of artillery could leave someone's throat. German veterans later said that TOT felt like being inside an explosion rather than near one. Examples of this devastation filled the 1944-1945 campaign. At St. Lo, the Americans used massed artillery to collapse German defenses on Hill 192, blasting through the hedgerow positions that had stalled months of infantry assaults. German survivors reported that the fire was not barrage, but annihilation, landing so suddenly that their officers had no time to react. At Mortain, Operation Lüttich, when Germany launched a desperate counterattack with elite SS Panzer units, American artillery crushed the assault. Hill 314's defenders, outnumbered and surrounded, survived only because U.S. artillery fired more than 10,000 rounds in support, guided hour by the L4s circling overhead. German POWs said later, "Our panzers could not advance. Artillery destroyed everything before we reached the Americans." At Hürtgenforst, the dense woods made spotting nearly impossible, but American observers used sound ranging and pre-registered targets to blanket every likely approach route. German infantry reported that the U.S. shells seemed to walk through the trees, bursting overhead and showering positions with deadly fragments. During the Ardennes offensive, when thick fog grounded most Allied aircraft, the Germans expected easy progress. Instead, they were hammered by American artillery that operated flawlessly even without air support. At Elsenborn Ridge, U.S. gunners fired more than 150,000 rounds in 5 days, stopping multiple SS Panzer thrusts cold and inflicting more losses than any American infantry or tank unit could have alone. There was another factor the Germans had not anticipated: American logistics. The U.S. Army could fire endlessly. Ammunition arrived by truck, train, or pipeline. Artillery units rotated barrels, swapped tubes, repaired carriages, and maintained guns with an industrial efficiency no Axis army could match. German artillery often ran out of ammunition within hours. American artillery often fired for days without interruption. And then, in late 1944, the Americans introduced the final devastating layer, the proximity fuse, VT fuse. Instead of burying itself in the ground, the shell detonated a few meters above the target. Infantry in foxholes were shredded by downward-angled fragmentation. Troops in woods were cut down by air bursts. Incoming German attacks, the kind that had once succeeded by sheer momentum, were broken apart in seconds. A German officer captured in January 1945 described the effect simply: "Your artillery kills before we can fight." This was the moment German morale cracked. It was no longer just speed or accuracy, it was inevitability. American artillery had become the dominant force on the battlefield, the thing German soldiers feared more than tanks, aircraft, or infantry. And as one POW put it, exhausted and still shaken after surviving the bulge, "Against your artillery, nothing we did mattered."
By the winter of 1944-45, American intelligence officers interrogating German POWs began to notice a pattern so consistent that it bordered on statistical certainty. Whether the prisoners were from panzer divisions, Volksgrenadier units, Fallschirmjäger regiments, or even elite Waffen-SS formations, they all ranked the same U.S. weapon as the most feared on the battlefield. Not the M4 Sherman, not the P-47 Thunderbolt, not the M1 Garand or American infantry firepower, and not even the strategic bombers that leveled German cities. Instead, they answered almost universally: Die amerikanische Artillerie, American artillery. To the German soldier, it was not just powerful, it was terrifying in a way no other American weapon had ever been. And when POWs were pressed to explain why, their responses uncovered 5 core reasons, each tied directly to the structural advantages the U.S. Army had built over years of doctrinal development. 1. Speed. The Americans could react before the Germans could move. The most repeated statement from POWs was simple and devastating: "Your artillery came too fast." German units were accustomed to artillery that took 10 to 15 minutes to adjust, especially when communications were disrupted. American artillery, guided by the FDC system and L4 grasshoppers, often responded in 3 to 5 minutes. Some battalions could do it even faster. A German platoon digging in near Sunlo described being struck before the shovel hit the ground. At Mortain, SS Panzer units advancing through hedgerows were bracketed almost instantly, as if the Americans already knew the route. This speed destroyed German momentum, shattered attacks, and made retreat just as dangerous as advance. 2. Precision. The Americans could hit anything they could see, and many things they couldn't. German POWs were adamant that U.S. artillery was the most accurate of any they encountered, including Soviet and British fire. The reason was simple: American forward observers could correct fire in real time, and American FDCs could compute those corrections instantly. One officer from the 2nd Panzer Division said, "Your shells did not fall around us, they fell on us." This was most painfully obvious in hedgerow country, where German units tried to hide in small orchards or carve positions into embankments. American artillery found them anyway. The L4 Grasshopper overhead ensured that no concealment was reliable. German soldiers began to feel that the Americans could see through trees, hedges, smoke, even darkness. 3. Mass firepower. The Americans could hit with an entire division at once. German POWs repeatedly emphasized that U.S. artillery did not fight as individual batteries. When an observer called for fire, dozens of guns, 105 millimeters, 155 millimeters, 8-inch, and sometimes even 240 millimeters, would converge on a single coordinate in minutes. At the Ardennes, a Volksgrenadier corporal described watching an entire battalion pounded flat in less than 10 minutes. At Elsenborn Ridge, SS units complained that American guns never stopped, firing round after round until German assaults dissolved. This overwhelming concentration created an impression of unstoppable force, a sense that American artillery acted like a single enormous weapon, not a collection of scattered guns. 4. Inevitability. There was no way to escape it. POWs frequently described American artillery as inescapable. If they ran, the L4 could see them. If they hid, proximity fuses detonated overhead. If they dug deeper, 155 and 8-inch guns cracked open their trench lines. If they paused to regroup, American observers corrected fire onto their new position. Even German armor, normally resistant to indirect fire, found itself disabled by near misses that crushed tracks, smashed optics, or immobilized engines. One SS Unterscharführer put it plainly, "When your artillery found us, we were already dead." 5. Proximity fuses, the technology that broke German attacks. By late 1944, the arrival of the VT proximity fuse changed American artillery from powerful to devastating. Shells no longer buried themselves harmlessly in soft earth. Instead, they exploded 6 to 10 meters above the ground, showering downward-directed fragments that killed troops even in shallow cover. German POWs said proximity fuses destroyed the very concept of infantry assault. At Elsenborn Ridge, entire battalions attempting to attack through the snow were shredded before they closed to rifle range. In the Saar, proximity fuses cleared entrenched defenders from trenches they had sworn were impregnable. A veteran from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division told interrogators, "We could not attack your lines because the shells exploded in the air. Nothing lived." The final verdict: artillery as a force of nature. In post-war interviews, German commanders like General Bayerlein of Panzerlehr stated openly that American artillery, not tanks, not aircraft, was the decisive factor in the Western Front. He famously told American officers, "You are a rich army, rich in artillery, rich in ammunition, rich in radios. Against this, there is no answer." German POWs echoed the same sentiment in thousands of intelligence summaries compiled by Schaeff, and nearly all summarized their fear in the same way. American artillery struck too fast to avoid, too accurately to endure, too massively to survive, and too continuously to escape. In their eyes, it wasn't merely a weapon. It was an overwhelming force, mathematical, invisible, and inevitable. And that is why German POWs, even those who had survived the Eastern Front, called American artillery the most terrifying weapon they faced in the entire war.